Imagine a Category 5 hurricane just makes a direct hit on your city.
Oh, wow. Okay, setting the scene right away.
Yeah, just picture it. The power grid completely fails. The roads are buckled. They're covered in debris. Just totally impassable.
Right, a total infrastructure collapse.
Exactly. Water stops flowing from the taps. And because of this, this total collapse, your local doctors are forced to literally drag patients out of the darkened, useless hospital
Out into the street.
into a cracked, dirt-blown parking lot. And they have to perform, like, open heart surgery right there in the dirt.
That is an absolutely terrifying image.
Right. But now I want you to imagine that your government is quietly sitting in boardrooms, looking at a map and passing legal frameworks to make sure that if a major war breaks out, that parking lot surgery, that is exactly the standard of care that you, as a civilian, are going to receive.
Yeah, that forces a complete mental reset, doesn't it? Because we are deeply, deeply conditioned to view healthcare as this fortress of safety.
Totally. The hospital is the neutral ground.
Right, the sanctuary. But when you actually look at the logistical blueprints of modern military planning, that neutrality just evaporates completely.
It's gone.
Gone.
Yeah.
The institution of healing is, well, it's being quietly drafted into the machinery of conflict.
And that is exactly why we're here. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a stark, frankly, urgent conversation about this exact intersection.
The collision of civilian healthcare, military armament, and the horrific reality of modern warfare.
Yes. And we are pulling our insights today from a really expansive, super heavy source text. It's a transcript from a Dutch YouTube channel called De Nieuwe Wereld.
Which translates to the New World.
Right. And the conversation is hosted by a doctor named Jona Walk, and she sits down for this long, intense discussion with Wil Verheggen.
And Verheggen brings a very particular, a very weighty perspective to this whole thing.
He really does.
Yeah, he is a former general practitioner. He spent years as a forensic doctor. And crucially for this deep dive, he is a former board member of the NVMP.
Which is the Dutch branch of the international organization, Doctors for Peace.
Exactly. So he's someone who has spent his entire professional life looking at the human body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether treating it in a clinic or examining it post-mortem.
Right.
And he's trying to reconcile all that medical reality with the violence that states inflict on one another.
But before we go any further, we have to set a very clear, very rigid boundary for you, the listener.
Oh, absolutely. This is critical.
The source material we are unpacking today wades into some highly charged, incredibly sensitive, and currently active geopolitical conflicts.
Right. The speakers in the transcript explicitly discuss the actions of Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas in Gaza, and the global footprint of the United States military.
So we need to make it absolutely unequivocally clear that in this deep dive, we are not taking sides.
At all. We are not making political endorsements. We are not validating the foreign policy of any state. And we are not, casting our own judgments on any of the nations or actors involved.
Zero judgment from us.
Our sole singular purpose here is to impartially report on the viewpoints, the facts as they are presented, and the severe ethical dilemmas raised by the medical professionals within this specific text.
We are just analyzing the anatomy of their argument, nothing more.
Exactly. We are looking at the x-ray they've handed us.
Right. I love that analogy. So keeping that strict analytical distance in mind, the catalyst for this entire conversation between Walk and Verheggen is a recent webinar.
A medical webinar, right?
Yes, it was organized by the KNMG. That's the Royal Dutch Medical Association, the main professional umbrella for doctors in the Netherlands.
And both of our source speakers attended this digital event.
They did. And it featured a presentation by a high-ranking military doctor. And this official was tasked with outlining the Defense Department's logistical plan for a theoretical, large-scale, high-intensity war.
Right, specifically detailing what the military calls the casualty evacuation chain.
The casualty evacuation chain, which is, just cold, bureaucratic terminology for how you move a shattered human body from the mud of a trench back to a sterile operating room.
It sounds so clinical when you say it like that.
It does. And the military doctor laid out this very structured, tiered system. According to his presentation, if a war breaks out, soldiers wounded on the front line would enter a multi-echelon system.
Okay, break that down for me. What are the echelons?
So you have the first echelon, which is the immediate field medics right at the point of injury.
Like literally in the dirt.
Exactly. Then they are stabilized and moved to the second echelon, which is a slightly more robust field hospital further back from the fighting.
Okay, that makes sense.
And finally, the most severely wounded, the ones requiring long-term, complex interventions, they are evacuated entirely out of the combat zone and sent all the way back to what military planners call the hinterland.
The hinterland.
Yes. And in this specific geopolitical scenario, the hinterland is the Netherlands itself.
Right. It is assumed to be this protected, fully functioning safe zone for medical recovery.
But this presentation, this is exactly where Verheggen experiences a profound sense of shock.
Why is he shocked? I mean, that sounds like standard military doctrine.
That's exactly the problem. He is watching this polished, modern PowerPoint presentation in the year 2024, and a terrifying realization just, well, washes over him.
Which is?
He is listening to the exact same logistical medical plan that he was taught when he completed his own mandatory military service 60 years ago.
Wow. 60 years ago.
A 6-decade-old playbook for a 21st century war.
That is wild. It's like trying to navigate a modern cyber warfare landscape using a hand-drawn paper map from the 19th century.
Yes, it fundamentally does not map onto the reality of the terrain today. The entire military paradigm for medical evacuation relies on a structural assumption that simply no longer exists.
The idea that there is a defined geographical front line where the violence is neatly contained.
Right, and a protected, peaceful hinterland where the healing happens undisturbed.
It is a dangerous, almost willful delusion on the part of the planners. It assumes the war stays over there, while the hospitals stay safe, fully powered, and well-stocked over here.
And Verheggen argues that this institutional cognitive dissonance is going to get people killed, because modern warfare has entirely obliterated the concept of a safe hinterland.
He points to several brutal contemporary examples right out of the text to illustrate this collapse of boundaries, right?
He does. First, he looks at the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the West Bank.
Right, and in that theater of war, the source notes the infrastructure of care isn't just strained, it is the actual target.
Yes. Hospitals themselves are subjected to bombardment. Medical personnel are arrested. But beyond the kinetic strikes, it's the systemic strangulation that destroys the care.
What do you mean by systemic strangulation?
Well, the foundational supplies required for a hospital to exist is anything more than a concrete shell. Clean water, medical-grade oxygen, sterile bandages.
And electricity, right?
Crucially, continuous electricity. All of that is reduced to a trickle or severed entirely.
Right, because if you don't have electricity, you don't have a hospital. You basically just have a warehouse of sick people.
That's exactly it. The ventilators stop. The neonatal incubators go cold.
The sterilization machines for surgical tools become giant metal paperweights.
The infrastructure itself is weaponized against the patient.
Precisely. You cannot evacuate a wounded soldier to a hospital that is experiencing a total systemic collapse. The idea of a safe zone just evaporates.
And then Verheggen points to the war in Ukraine to further dismantle this illusion.
Because Ukraine is a completely different type of conflict, right?
Right. He acknowledges that, yes, in the east of Ukraine, there is a traditional grinding First World War-style front line with trenches and artillery.
But the hinterland.
Exactly. The so-called hinterland, cities located hundreds of miles away from those trenches, is constantly bombarded from the sky.
Drones and ballistic missiles.
Yep. They systematically bypass the front line to target public utilities. They are aiming for the water purification plants, the national power grid, the thermal heating plants in the dead of the freezing winter.
So even if a hospital in Kyiv or Lviv isn't hit directly by a missile, the missile taking out the regional power grid renders that hospital just as paralyzed as a canvas field tent sitting a mile from the artillery fire.
That is exactly Verheggen's point. And he uses this incredibly visceral analogy in the interview to really, shake his colleagues awake.
Is this the earthquake analogy?
Yes. He compares the resulting chaos of this modern total war to the aftermath of a massive civilization-altering natural disaster. He specifically brings up the aftermath of a severe earthquake in Venezuela.
Oh, right. Because think about what happens in a 7.0 magnitude quake.
Total destruction.
The asphalt roads are sheared in half and buckled. You physically cannot get heavy machinery in to clear the rubble.
Yeah.
Supply chains for basic medical necessities cease to exist.
And what is the result? Doctors are forced to gather the bleeding and the crushed on those cracked open-air parking lots.
Right. They are performing amputations and triage in the dirt, without sterile fields, without proper anesthesia, without any of the machinery of modern medicine.
It strips away all the technological advancements of the last century in an absolute instant.
And Verheggen is looking at his peers in the Dutch medical establishment, looking at these military planners, and he is just screaming this reality at them.
He is saying this parking lot surgery, that is the reality you will face if a major war breaks out in Europe.
Yeah, the idea that you will be standing in a pristine, climate-controlled, brilliantly lit ICU in Amsterdam, calmly receiving a steady stream of wounded soldiers from a distant front, he says that is a bureaucratic fantasy.
So it's the conventional weapons of modern war, the drones and the ballistic missiles, can completely dismantle a nation's power grid and turn a state-of-the-art hospital into a dark, freezing building? Well, it forces a really uncomfortable pivot in the conversation.
Because if the hinterland isn't safe from conventional strikes, we have to look at the absolute ceiling of destruction.
Yes. We have to talk about the threat that the medical community seems most desperate to ignore. And that takes us deep into Verheggen's historical background, which the source text spends a significant amount of time exploring.
We have to talk about the catastrophic math of nuclear weapons.
Right. And to understand his urgency, you have to understand where he was in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
He was working as a GP.
Yes,
Yeah.
as a general practitioner in a Dutch city called Tilburg. And this was the absolute peak of the Cold War.
Right. The arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was at a fever pitch.
And he felt this overwhelming medical and ethical obligation to speak out. This culminated in December of 1980. He and a colleague didn't write some political manifesto complaining about ideologies.
They kept it medical.
Purely medical, a physical scenario. And they bought a full-page ad in a major national newspaper to publish it.
Wow. A full-page ad just for this.
Yep. They detailed, using cold, hard physics, exactly what would happen if a single 1 megaton nuclear bomb was dropped on the massive port city of Rotterdam.
And we really need to linger on the mathematical reality Verheggen presented to the Dutch public here, because it's a scale of violence that the human brain genuinely struggles to process.
It really is.
We aren't evolved to comprehend this level of instant destruction. A 1 megaton bomb. The source text breaks down the geographical zones of destruction, and the sheer scale is paralyzing.
I found this part of the transcript so sobering because it removes all the political rhetoric and just focuses on the biology.
Right, what physically happens to a body.
Exactly. If that 1 megaton bomb detonates over Rotterdam, the source details that within a 1-2 kilometer radius of ground zero, the heat generated is quite literally comparable to the surface of the sun.
The surface of the sun, just let that sink in.
The human beings standing in this zone do not die of blunt force trauma. They do not bleed to death. They are vaporized.
The heat flash travels at the speed of light.
Right. And human nerve conduction, the speed at which a pain signal travels from your skin to your brain to tell you that you are burning, it's significantly slower than the speed of light.
Oh, wow.
So the people in this 1-2 kilometer radius are turned to ash before their central nervous systems even have the milliseconds required to register that a flash has occurred.
It is the instantaneous erasure of biology.
Yes.
So from a medical logistical standpoint, you have 0 hospital admissions from that inner zone. There's no one left to treat, and the hospitals that were in that zone are entirely gone.
Poof. Gone.
Then you move out to the next ring, a 10 to 15 kilometer radius. In this zone, the thermal radiation triggers a massive self-sustaining firestorm.
Every single combustible material, wood, plastics, fabrics, asphalt, it all ignites simultaneously.
And the sheer volume of fire actually sucks the ambient oxygen out of the atmosphere to feed the flame.
Which creates hurricane-force winds of fire.
Exactly. Winds that asphyxiate anyone who managed to survive the initial blast by hiding deep underground.
And the horror doesn't stop there. The text follows the destruction all the way down to the city of Dordrecht, which is roughly 20 kilometers away from Rotterdam.
20 kilometers is far.
It is, but at 20 kilometers, the atmospheric overpressure, the physical shockwave of displaced air moving faster than the speed of sound is so violent that it shatters every window in the city and collapses the brick and concrete facades of buildings.
It turns a dense urban environment into a lethal blizzard of flying glass and masonry.
And it extends even further. The source specifically mentions the city of Breda. Breda is about 50 kilometers away from Rotterdam.
50 kilometers.
50. Verheggen notes in the text that even at that massive distance, the flash of thermal radiation is so intense that if you were simply walking your dog outside the moment the bomb detonated in Rotterdam, the light alone would instantly cause first-degree burns on any exposed skin.
From a city 50 kilometers away.
It's incomprehensible. But this is exactly why Verheggen is so deeply frustrated.
Hmm.
His frustration just radiates through the transcript when he talks about how abstractly modern politicians and military planners discuss these weapons.
Right. He says they talk about nuclear warheads as if they are bags of sugar.
Bags of sugar. They treat them like benign inventory items on a logistical spreadsheet.
He points out a very dark, bitter irony here, right?
Yeah, he says if you go to the store and buy regular consumer-grade fireworks for a holiday, the box is covered in government-mandated warning labels about keeping a safe distance and not holding them in your hand.
But these civilization-ending weapons are discussed in Parliament and on television with almost zero real acknowledgement of their physical reality.
It is a deliberate sterilization of language to mask an apocalyptic reality.
At the height of the Cold War, the text notes, there were tens of thousands of these weapons stockpiled globally.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, Verheggen points out that if you calculated the total explosive yield of the global arsenal at that time, there was the equivalent of 5,000 tons of TNT allocated for every single human being on planet Earth.
5,000 tons of high explosives per person. That goes so far beyond deterrence, it's an absurdity of overkill.
Absolutely.
And there's this incredible, almost surreal anecdote in the text that perfectly captures this absurdity. In 1981, Verheggen attends the very first Congress of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the IPPNW.
Right. This was designed to be this highly balanced diplomatic medical event.
Exactly. 10 Soviet doctors, 10 American doctors, and a handful of Europeans. And Verheggen is sitting there rubbing shoulders with the absolute elite of the global defense and scientific establishment.
And what he observes is chilling, not because of malice, but because of extreme casualness.
Yes.
He notes a top advisor to the Kremlin speaking about the Soviet nuclear posture with an entirely deadpan delivery. The advisor nonchalantly tells the room, yeah, we have a red button, and if we push it, the bomb goes off.
No gravity, no weight to the words at all.
Just administrative fact. And then he listens to a scientist from the Los Alamos Project, the American laboratory that gave birth to the first atomic bomb.
And what did he say?
This scientist tells a story about how he finally quit the Manhattan Project, but not because he suddenly had a moral epiphany about the physics of splitting the atom.
Right.
He quit because he realized, looking around the lab, that they were still frantically working day and night to build the bomb, even after Hitler was defeated.
Wow. The original existential justification for the weapon was gone, but the bureaucratic and industrial machine just kept running on its own momentum.
Exactly. Verheggen says he almost fell out of his chair listening to these people.
The banality of apocalyptic power. The people with their hands near the buttons were treating the whole enterprise like an abstract game of geopolitical chess.
But here is where I want to push back.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people listening to this are probably having the exact same thought.
Let's hear it.
We are talking about 1980, 1981. That was the absolute climax of Cold War paranoia. But then the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. We had the 1990s, the era of massive disarmament.
Didn't we sign treaties?
Exactly. Didn't we solve this specific existential dread? I mean, isn't the threat of global nuclear annihilation kind of a relic of the past?
It is the most natural, logical question to ask. But Verheggen argues it is also the most dangerous form of modern complacency.
Complacency.
Yes, he directly attacks this assumption in the interview. Yes, there was a period of political detente. There were incredibly important world-saving treaties signed.
Like the INF Treaty, right?
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which successfully removed an entire class of destabilizing nuclear missiles from Europe. And he points to the START treaties, the Strategic Arms Reduction treaties, which physically dismantled long-range bombers and destroyed missile silos, drastically reducing global stockpiles.
And for a brief window in history, they were.
I did.
So what changed?
The political architecture collapsed. As Verheggen points out, those treaties have effectively been dissolved over the last decade. The U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty citing Russian noncompliance. Russia suspended participation in the New START Treaty.
So the hard-won arms control framework of the late 20th century is essentially a dead letter.
Exactly. The stockpiles might be numerically smaller than they were in 1985, but the threat has not diminished. It has evolved into something arguably more volatile and far more complex.
Okay, unpack that for me. If we mathematically have fewer total nuclear bombs today than we did in the 80s, how can the landscape be more volatile?
Because the military doctrine has shifted from deterrence to usability.
Usability.
Yes. The text highlights a terrifying trend in modern strategic thinking. Military generals and think tanks are now actively advocating for the development and deployment of small or tactical nuclear weapons for the battlefield.
Right. The argument being pitched to politicians is that these weapons are small enough to be usable.
Exactly. They argue you could drop a low-yield tactical nuke on a tank battalion or a naval carrier group, achieve a massive military victory, but avoid destroying a whole city and triggering the end of the world.
Usable nukes. It's a complete oxymoron. It's like trying to domesticate the apocalypse.
Domesticating the apocalypse, that's exactly what it is. And Verheggen argues it is a fatal civilization-ending illusion.
He breaks down the cold game theory of it, doesn't he?
He does. He says once a single nuclear weapon is detonated in anger, regardless of whether its yield is 1 kiloton or 100 kilotons, you have crossed the nuclear threshold.
The taboo is broken.
Yes, and where is the logical endpoint? If one side uses a small tactical bomb to vaporize a trench line, the other side is compelled to retaliate with a slightly larger tactical bomb to destroy the airbase that launched it.
Right, there is absolutely no historical precedent, no psychological mechanism, and no diplomatic off-ramp proven to stop that escalation ladder once you are on it.
It inevitably spirals toward the massive, city-killing strategic weapons. You can't just have a little bit of nuclear war.
But it gets even more precarious when you factor in modern delivery systems.
Oh, the hypersonic missiles.
Yes. I was reading the section where the text discusses the hypersonic missile dilemma, and it honestly gave me chills.
Let's walk through this scenario for the listener because it's terrifying.
Let's say a radar station in Europe detects an incoming hypersonic missile. Because it's moving at Mach 5 or faster, the receiving country has mere minutes to react.
Maybe 4 minutes, tops.
Right. But here's the fatal flaw in the system. Radar can tell you the speed and trajectory of the missile, but it cannot tell you what is inside the warhead.
Is it carrying a conventional high explosive, or is it carrying a nuclear bomb?
You literally cannot know until it detonates.
Yeah.
The physics of radar don't allow you to see the payload.
Right. So put yourself in the shoes of the defending military commander. The alarm is sounding. You have 4 minutes before impact. Do you wait to find out what kind of bomb it is?
And if you wait, and it is a nuclear weapon targeting your own nuclear silos or command centers, your ability to strike back is destroyed. You lose the war instantly.
Or do you assume the worst, push the red button, and launch a full nuclear retaliation before the incoming missile even lands, just guessing that it might be a nuclear strike?
You are forcing human beings to gamble the fate of the biosphere on incomplete radar data under extreme time pressure.
It is an impossible, unwinnable situation.
And this specific technological dilemma brings the conversation crashing back to the extreme vulnerability of Europe, and specifically the Netherlands.
Right, because in the interview, the host, Jona Walk, brings up a very pointed, highly uncomfortable detail about Dutch national security.
The Netherlands currently hosts American nuclear weapons on its soil, reportedly at the Volkel Air Base.
Right, they are physically sitting inside the borders of the Netherlands.
Yes, and Walk emphasizes a massive point of frustration regarding sovereignty here. Dutch politicians, the democratically elected Dutch parliament, the citizens of the Netherlands, they have absolutely zero say in whether those weapons are ever fired.
None at all. The ultimate command and control, the finger on the button, lies entirely with the President of the United States.
She points out the terrifying lack of agency here. Even if a highly polarizing U.S. president, perhaps someone the Dutch public and government fundamentally despise or disagree with, decides to launch a preemptive strike, the missiles launch from Dutch soil.
So the Netherlands assumes 100% of the existential risk of being a nuclear launch pad, while retaining 0% of the agency over how those weapons are used.
By simply hosting them, the Netherlands paints a massive target on its own back.
Because if a conflict breaks out, an adversary is absolutely going to target those silos immediately to neutralize the threat.
Precisely. And the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting to make this even more complex.
That's so.
The text notes that with the United States increasingly questioning its long-term financial and military commitments to NATO and expressing desires to pull back from European defense, other European nuclear powers are trying to step into the vacuum.
Like France.
Exactly. France, for example, has reportedly floated the idea of offering its independent nuclear arsenal its ballistic missile submarines and nuclear-capable fighter jets to form a nuclear umbrella to protect the rest of Europe.
Which sounds like a gesture of solidarity, but what it actually does is push the European Union toward becoming a unified, nuclear-armed megastate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which Verheggen points out is the exact opposite trajectory of where the non-proliferation movement has been trying to guide the world for 50 years.
He connects all of this escalating tension, the tactical nukes, the hypersonic missiles, the shifting nuclear umbrellas, to a core historical belief that underpins his entire philosophy.
That amassing more weapons has never led to more safety.
The dominant political philosophy in Europe right now is we must arm ourselves to the teeth to prevent war.
But Verheggen counters that if stockpiling weapons actually equaled safety, the history of human civilization wouldn't be an endless, unbroken series of increasingly destructive wars.
The theory of deterrence is flawless right up until the exact second it fails completely.
And when it fails, when the political posturing collapses into actual violence, the consequences do not fall on the politicians.
No, they fall squarely, crushingly on the civilian medical system. Which brings us right back to that CanMG webinar we started with, where the Defense Department is outlining its plans.
Yes, let's pivot back to that presentation because this is where all of this geopolitical abstraction crashes violently into the reality of your local neighborhood hospital.
Right.
The webinar made it crystal clear that the Dutch Defense Department, in coordination with civilian hospital administrators, is actively preparing for a theoretical, large-scale conventional war.
And the scenario they frequently cite in their wargaming is Dutch soldiers deploying to the east to fight in a major conflict, presumably against a power like Russia.
And the planners are anticipating a casualty rate that is, frankly, hard to fathom.
Tell me.
We're talking about hundreds, potentially up to 1,000 wounded soldiers returning to the Netherlands every single day.
1,000 casualties a day. I want to really sit with that number for a second because we throw these statistics around lately.
1,000 trauma patients a day.
If you look at the logistical capacity of a major state-of-the-art military hospital, receiving 1,000 complex blast injuries, burns, and amputations would completely overwhelm their surgical suites, their blood banks, and their ICU beds in less than 24 hours.
The military medical infrastructure would buckle on day one.
So where do the overflow casualties go on day 2, day 3, day 30? They have to go into the civilian healthcare system.
And this is exactly where the logistics mutate into an absolute ethical nightmare.
The source text outlines 2 primary logistical scenarios that the government is actively considering for how to manage this massive influx of shattered military bodies into civilian spaces, right?
Yes. Let's break those down.
Yeah.
The first scenario is quota-based.
Okay, what does that mean?
The government would bypass normal triage protocols and dictate strict daily quotas to civilian hospitals. They would essentially contact a local hospital administrator and say, you must clear a specific ward and accept 50 wounded soldiers today.
Wow. It doesn't matter who is currently in those beds. It doesn't matter what your surgical backlog is. You must take these soldiers.
Exactly. The second scenario is even more totalizing. The military simply suspends normal civilian administration and takes over the entire patient flow and resource distribution of the national healthcare system.
Like how patient distribution and ICU beds were centrally managed by the state during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, exactly like that.
Yeah.
But instead of a virus dictating the flow, the military command is directing medical traffic based entirely on the strategic needs of the war effort.
Now, on paper, if you are a logistics officer, that sounds like a totally rational, necessary emergency measure, right?
A national existential crisis requires a centralized, authoritarian response to manage chaos.
But the source points out that imposing this structure on doctors places them in a profound, almost unresolvable moral bind.
It strikes a dagger directly into the heart of the Hippocratic Oath.
Medical ethics, established over millennia, are built on one foundational, unshakable principle: impartiality.
A doctor treats a patient based solely on the severity of their medical need.
If a civilian arrives in the emergency room with a life-threatening arterial bleed from a car crash, and a soldier arrives at the exact same time with a less severe, non-life-threatening shrapnel wound, the doctor treats the civilian first.
The oath even dictates that a doctor must treat an enemy combatant with the exact same care and priority as their own countrymen if the enemy's medical need is greater.
Equal treatment based on the severity of the wound, not the color of the uniform.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
But if the government implements these mandatory quotas or takes over the triage system entirely to prioritize military readiness, they're essentially mandating that the uniform supersedes the wound.
They are legally forcing civilian doctors to prioritize a stable, wounded soldier over a critically ill civilian, regardless of established medical triage protocols.
It forces the doctor to actively violate their core ethical code.
And Walk and Verheggen are relentless in pointing out the cascading, catastrophic knock-on effects this would have for the civilian population.
They emphasize that in this scenario, civilian care wouldn't just experience long wait times, it would functionally cease to exist. It would regress to the Stone Age.
Because people forget that the resources required for modern medicine, the sterile plastics, the specialized drugs, the highly trained personnel, they are finite.
Right. We aren't just talking about a hospital running low on gauze and ibuprofen. We're talking about the complete halting of all complex life-sustaining care.
Because if the military commandeers the supply chains to funnel resources to the war effort, there are no chemical precursors left to manufacture chemotherapy drugs for cancer patients.
If the military is commandeering the national blood supply to manage battlefield transfusions, there is literally no blood left in the fridge for a civilian who suffers a massive postpartum hemorrhage.
There are no specialized materials left to manufacture heart stents. The surgical suites are too full of soldiers to treat a civilian stroke victim in that crucial golden hour.
It is the complete systemic cannibalization of the civilian health apparatus to feed the war machine.
So if you are listening to this, you might be wondering, what does this actually mean for me? Well, the text highlights a glaring, deeply cynical hypocrisy in how governments communicate risk.
You've probably seen the public service announcements. The government tells citizens to build a 3-day survival kit in case of a national emergency.
Get a battery-powered radio, stock up on bottled water, buy a few cans of beans, and shelter in place.
But the grim, unspoken reality that the medical planners know and that Verheggen is exposing is that if you survive those 3 days on your canned beans, but you happen to suffer a heart attack on day 4 of a major conflict, the hospital simply will not treat you.
The doors will be locked to you because the beds are full of soldiers.
It is an illusion of preparedness. The state is managing the public's anxiety with pamphlets about radios and beans, while quietly acknowledging behind closed doors that the fundamental social contract of healthcare will be completely severed the moment the war begins.
But wait, I have to stop here. Because if I'm a doctor in a civilian hospital and a military commander walks in and tells me to stop treating my cancer patients and start treating soldiers with twisted ankles, I would just say no.
Right, you'd think so.
Surely a democratic government in a free society cannot just forcefully hijack the hospitals and force civilian doctors to abandon their own patients. How is that remotely legal? What is the enforcement mechanism?
And that question pulls us directly into the legal architecture that makes this nightmare entirely possible.
Lay it on me.
The source text discusses how this theoretical commandeering of healthcare isn't just a military brainstorm. It is actively codified in Dutch law.
They bring up two specific pieces of legislation that grant the state these terrifying powers, right?
Yes, the first one they discuss is called the Noodwet Geneeskundigen, which roughly translates to the emergency healthcare law.
And just to clarify, this isn't some new reactionary law passed in response to recent events, right?
No, it's older. It dates back to the 1970s. It is a legislative relic of the Cold War, drafted during a time when the fear of Soviet invasion was acute. But crucially, it is still on the books today.
Okay, so when does it actually trigger?
This law is designed to activate under what the legislation vaguely calls extraordinary circumstances, which, as Verheggen notes, is just a polite, sanitized, bureaucratic euphemism for the outbreak of war.
Okay, so when these extraordinary circumstances are declared, what does this law actually do?
When activated, this law grants sweeping, almost dictatorial powers to the military. It dictates that the military commander, not the elected prime minister, not the parliament, but the military command structure, has the absolute legal authority to dictate exactly where civilian doctors work, what kind of medicine they practice, and precisely who they're allowed to treat.
So, legally, a pediatric oncologist working in Amsterdam could be ripped out of her clinic, ordered to travel to a military trauma ward in the east of the country, and forced to perform triage on combat wounds.
Yes. It legally and completely strips doctors of their professional autonomy. It forcibly severs the relationship between the doctor and their normal patient population.
That is wild.
Now, the text points out that government officials often present this law mildly to the public, framing it simply as a necessary administrative tool to prevent doctors from fleeing the country during a crisis.
But Walk and Verheggen argue that if you read the actual text of the law, it allows for the total subjugation of medical personnel to military orders.
It turns doctors into conscripts.
Okay, that's the 1970s law. But the text also mentions a new legislative push.
Yes, there is a current modern legislative proposal called the Wet Up the Defense Secret Hide, or the Defense Readiness Law.
And Walk and Verheggen spend time analyzing this proposal, and they identify two major glaring red flags that should deeply concern the civilian healthcare sector.
Break those down for me. What is the first major concern?
The first massive red flag is about data privacy. The proposed law contains provisions that would allow the Defense Department to collect and analyze vast amounts of citizen health data from civilian medical databases.
Walk raises a very specific, chilling question here. Why does the military need access to the private, confidential health records of the general civilian population?
The obvious, deeply concerning implication she draws is that the military wants to use this data algorithmically to identify able-bodied individuals for a potential military draft.
Which is crazy because a doctor's primary sacred duty is patient confidentiality. If you tell your doctor about a physical condition, that stays in the room.
This law would essentially transform the National Medical Database into a targeted recruitment tool for the armed forces.
That is a fundamental breach of trust. If a patient knows their health data is being sifted by the military, they will stop being honest with their doctors.
And what was the second red flag they identified in this new law?
Environmental and public health hazards. The proposed Defense Readiness Law would allow the military to legally commandeer civilian environments, farmland, private infrastructure, urban areas, to conduct large-scale military exercises.
Crucially, the text notes that this includes exercises involving the active use of toxic substances, chemical agents, and experimental weapons.
And the most chilling part of the legislation. Walk points out that there are absolutely zero provisions written into the law regarding the public health consequences if something goes wrong.
So if there is a chemical spill, a contamination event, or an accidental exposure during one of these exercises, the law offers no framework for how the military will protect, compensate, or treat the affected civilians.
It's essentially writing a blank check for the military to operate with absolute impunity inside the borders of their own country, treating the civilian landscape like a disposable testing ground.
Exactly. Walk and Verheggen argue that these laws, both the old Cold War relic and the new proposal, are presented to the public and Parliament as tedious, necessary bureaucratic housekeeping for national security.
But in practice, they represent the total, structural, and legal hijacking of the civilian medical apparatus by the military-industrial complex.
Okay, I have to jump in and play devil's advocate here because this is where the debate gets incredibly thorny. I can hear a listener arguing right now, look, war is hell. It is chaos.
Right.
If a nation is facing a truly existential threat, if an invading army is crossing the border, doesn't the government absolutely need these draconian powers?
The utilitarian argument.
Right. Don't we have to suspend the normal, comfortable rules of peacetime to ensure the survival of the state? Yes, forcing doctors to prioritize soldiers is ugly, but if the army falls, the whole country falls. Isn't it a grim necessity?
You are articulating the classic utilitarian argument for state survival. The end justifies the means. But Verheggen pushes back against that framing with everything he has.
How does he counter that?
His argument is rooted in the absolute inviolability of medical ethics. He asserts that doctors, as a united profession, should never preemptively accept legal frameworks that explicitly force them to violate their oaths.
The Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm and to treat patients based on need, does not have a footnote that says, unless the military commander says otherwise.
Exactly. So his point is that by quietly accepting these laws in peacetime, the medical community is already surrendering its moral high ground before the first shot is even fired.
If doctors allow the state to legally redefine medical ethics to serve the war effort, they cease to be healers and simply become logistical assets of the military.
And Verheggen argues this legal framework doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is just one symptom of a much broader, much more dangerous cultural shift that the source material spends a lot of time analyzing.
The creeping militarization of everyday society.
Yes, and this cultural shift isn't just happening in closed-door parliamentary meetings or sterile medical webinars. It's happening visibly right out in the open in the broader culture.
The source points out how military figures and military aesthetics have become omnipresent in daily civilian life. You turn on the television, and retired generals are on talk shows every single day, standing in front of digital maps, analyzing front lines and troop movements with the exact same casual enthusiasm as sports commentators analyzing a football match.
There is a concerted, deliberate effort to make the military seem accessible, normal, and even glamorous.
They cite a very specific, highly visible example of this cultural shift in the Netherlands, don't they?
The text notes that the Dutch queen and the crown princess were recently photographed participating in military exercises. They were wearing full combat gear, helmets, and black tactical face paint, smiling for the cameras.
It's royal PR masking as military readiness.
Exactly. And the source argues that the psychological intent behind this imagery is to soften the inherently brutal image of the military.
It is designed to make armament, defense spending, and the preparation for war seem like a normal, unquestionable, and even unifying civic duty.
Verheggen is deeply disturbed by this normalization. He draws a direct, chilling parallel between this current cultural atmosphere and the societal mood in the lead-up to World War I.
That's a heavy, deeply profound comparison. The Guns of August scenario, where Europe just sleepwalked right into a meat grinder.
It is the perfect historical parallel. He notes that in the years preceding 1914, European nations were eagerly, almost joyfully militarizing. They were plastering romanticized recruitment posters on every street corner.
And when war was finally declared, populations in London, Paris, and Berlin actually cheered in the streets.
They celebrated because there had been a long, comfortable period of relative peace, and society had completely forgotten the visceral, muddy, flesh-tearing horrors of industrialized combat.
They thought war was going to be a quick, glorious adventure. The text describes today's political leaders as possessing a similar narcissistic mindset, totally abandoning the difficult, unglamorous, frustrating work of diplomacy in favor of the macho, simplistic posturing of armament.
It's the old adage that if you spend a fortune buying a giant hammer, eventually every complex geopolitical problem starts looking like a nail.
But here's where the source gets terrifyingly specific about the real-world consequences of this militarization. It's not just about bad PR or societal vibes. It's about making your own civilian infrastructure a legitimate target.
Yes, they bring up a very specific manufacturing facility in Hengelo, a city in the eastern part of the Netherlands.
This is perhaps the most crucial, concrete point in their entire argument about the illusion of the safe hinterland.
The source notes that this specific factory in Hengelo manufactures highly advanced components for military drones.
And to be clear, these aren't just defensive surveillance drones. These components are being actively supplied to Ukraine, and they are being used to build drones that are currently striking targets deep inside Russian territory.
And this requires us to momentarily adopt the cold, ruthless, amoral logic of military strategy. The text breaks this logic down perfectly.
Currently, the Ukrainian military is executing a highly successful strategy of striking Russian support structures, oil refineries, ammunition depots, and air bases that are located hundreds of miles behind the active front line, deep in the Russian hinterland.
They are systematically targeting the supply chain of the war machine.
Which, from a purely tactical military standpoint, makes perfect sense. You starve the front line by destroying the factories in the back.
It does make tactical sense. But Verheggen flips the perspective to show the danger. If the Netherlands is manufacturing and supplying the specific drone parts that are actively flying into Russia and killing people, whether they are soldiers or civilian collateral damage, then the Netherlands is an active, undeniable participant in that lethal supply chain.
It requires very little imagination, the source argues, to foresee a scenario where a Russian military strategist decides to apply the exact same tactical logic to Europe.
If Ukraine can hit Russian factories to stop the weapons, Russia can hit European factories to stop the weapons.
Exactly. The strategic question becomes, why waste millions of dollars trying to shoot down swarms of drones in the air over Moscow when you can just launch one hypersonic missile and completely destroy the factory in Hengelo before the drones are even assembled?
The source explicitly notes that radical, hawkish voices within the Russian political and media establishment have already publicly suggested this exact strategy.
They have openly argued on television that dropping one bomb on Rotterdam or targeting key European manufacturing hubs would instantly terrify the West and stop the flow of weapons to Ukraine.
So the terrifying conclusion here is that by heavily arming the conflict, in an attempt to project strength and support an ally, we're actively painting a glowing bullseye on civilian manufacturing towns in the Netherlands.
We are inviting the war directly into the hinterland. We are making ourselves the front line.
That is the core beating heart of their warning. The militarization of a civilian society doesn't make that society safer. It officially transforms it into a legitimate military target.
Which begs a massive, echoing question that I have been wondering since we started this deep dive. If the risks are truly this existential, if we are talking about the very real possibility of nuclear strikes on major ports, hypersonic missiles hitting drone factories in suburban towns, and the total legal, ethical collapse of the civilian healthcare system, why is no one in the broader medical field screaming from the rooftops?
Yeah, why is this incredibly urgent warning relegated to a fringe conversation on a YouTube channel instead of being the headline of every major medical journal in the world?
That silence is profound, and it is exactly what we need to unpack as we near the end of their discussion. The source material reveals a deep, bitter frustration with the medical community at large.
Walk and Verheggen describe a professional culture paralyzed by apathy, and more pointedly, a culture silenced by fear.
Yeah, Jona Walk is incredibly candid about this. She talks about how she tries to bring these issues up, and there is almost zero pushback or engagement from her colleagues.
In fact, she points out a deeply disturbing trend. She says some doctors actually find the idea of helping the military prepare for a massive war to be exciting or cool.
Like it's a gritty, adrenaline-fueled action movie break from the mundane routine of prescribing blood pressure medications and managing diabetes.
It is a dark adolescent fantasy of battlefield triage, completely divorced from the horrific reality of total infrastructure collapse. They want the drama of saving a soldier, but they don't comprehend that they will be doing it in the dark, without painkillers, while the city burns around them.
But the source's criticism goes much higher than just individual, naive doctors. It takes direct aim at the massive institutions that govern medicine.
They specifically single out the KNMG and the broader international medical umbrella organizations.
Right, and they bring up a very specific, highly controversial contemporary example to highlight this institutional complicity and cowardice.
Yes, the text fiercely criticizes the international medical establishment for its inaction and silence regarding the ongoing conflict in Gaza.
The source states that despite the total internationally documented destruction of the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza, where hospitals have been repeatedly bombed, besieged, and doctors have been killed in staggering numbers, the international medical body allows the Israeli Medical Association to remain a member in good standing.
And the text goes further, claiming that this Israeli Medical Association actively supports the state's military policies in the conflict.
And again, just to reiterate our boundary, we are reporting the source's characterization of this deeply complex geopolitical dynamic. But their broader, overarching point is about the danger of institutional silence in the face of state violence.
Precisely. The source explicitly labels this silence as cowardice. They argue that these massive medical institutions completely lack the courage to speak out against state-sanctioned violence when doing so is professionally risky, politically unpopular, or might jeopardize their funding.
They point out the hypocrisy. These medical bodies are more than willing to aggressively advocate for public health when it's safe and universally agreed upon, like running massive anti-smoking campaigns or pushing for seatbelt laws, but they completely fold and become silent accomplices when the state demands complicity in the machinery of war.
It's easy to be brave when the stakes are low. It's easy to fight tobacco companies. It's terrifying to fight the Ministry of Defense.
But Verheggen offers a beautiful, profound counter-philosophy to this cowardice, doesn't he? He argues that advocating for peace isn't just some fringe, left-wing political hobby that doctors can dabble in on the weekends. He views it as the absolute core of their medical duty.
He introduces a foundational concept from the text, quoting the famous 19th century German physician and pathologist Rudolf Virchow. Virchow famously stated, "Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale."
That is such a powerful framework. Politics is medicine on a large scale.
It completely redefines the role of the doctor. Verheggen argues that if a doctor's sworn duty is to prevent disease, alleviate suffering, and save lives, then war is simply the largest, most predictable, and most entirely preventable public health disaster imaginable.
An artillery shell is just a highly efficient vector for trauma. Therefore, using your professional standing to advocate for peace, to demand diplomacy, and to refuse to participate in war planning isn't political activism. It is the ultimate, highest form of preventative medicine.
It's the idea of preventing the trauma before the skin is ever broken, rather than just passively waiting in a tent to bandage the bleeding after the politicians fail.
Exactly. Why does society spend billions of dollars and decades of research developing microscopic targeted cancer treatments if the medical community is going to silently allow the state to build geopolitical policies that could literally vaporize millions of people in a single afternoon?
And that question exposes this massive, glaring cognitive dissonance in our modern society.
Hmm.
The text touches on this near the end, and it really struck me as the most profound takeaway.
Think about it. As a society, we spend immense amounts of time, money, and political energy obsessing over the minutia of survival. We argue endlessly in Parliament over healthcare budgets. We debate insurance premiums. We meticulously calculate carbon offsets, ban plastic straws, and build complex, century-long CO2 models to save the environment.
We hyperfixate on the margins of public health and safety.
Right. We are completely obsessed with micromanaging the plumbing. We are arguing over how to fix a leaky faucet, while totally willfully ignoring the fact that the entire foundation of the house is rigged with tons of dynamite.
The text points out a terrifying scientific reality that we refuse to acknowledge. We are so focused on the slow, incremental dangers of climate change, but we ignore the fact that a limited nuclear exchange, say just 100 tactical bombs dropped between two regional powers, would throw enough soot and ash into the stratosphere to cause a sudden global drop in temperature.
The scientific reality of a nuclear winter.
Yes, it wouldn't take a century. Within months, it would cause global crop failures, massive, unprecedented famine, and the total, irreversible collapse of the environmental biosphere.
We're meticulously regulating emissions to save the planet, while simultaneously normalizing the existence and deployment of weapons that can end the biosphere before dinner time. The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It requires a profound, society-wide, willful blindness to maintain that contradiction.
Yeah.
And shattering that blindness is exactly what Verheggen and Walk are desperately trying to achieve with this conversation.
So as we wrap up this incredibly heavy deep dive, let's quickly retrace the massive ground we've covered today. We started by dismantling that comfortable 60-year-old illusion of the safe hinterland.
We looked at how the brutal realities of modern conflict in places like Gaza and Ukraine prove that hospitals are no longer sanctuaries. They are primary targets in war of infrastructure.
We then walked through the catastrophic, incomprehensible math of the nuclear threat. We explored how the vital arms control treaties of the 20th century have dissolved, replaced by a dangerous, delusional normalization of tactical weapons, placing European nations that host these weapons directly in the crosshairs of a preemptive strike.
We looked at the terrifying ethical collapse waiting for civilian health care, exploring how Cold War-era emergency laws and new defense readiness proposals could legally force civilian doctors to abandon their Hippocratic oaths, prioritizing the military over the sick and sending civilian medical care back to the Stone Age.
And finally, we examine the creeping, romanticized militarization of everyday society, the deeply frustrating silence of the international medical establishment, and Verheggen's urgent, impassioned call for doctors to reclaim their role.
To step up and treat aggressive diplomacy and the demand for peace as the ultimate form of preventative medicine.
And as a quick final reminder before we close, the geopolitical opinions, the characterizations of specific international conflicts, and the intense criticisms of state policies discussed today were exclusively those of the original speakers in the source text.
We explored them here purely to map the anatomy of their argument regarding the intersection of healthcare and war. We're dissecting the implications of their text, not endorsing the politics behind it.
Exactly. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on that amazing quote from Virchow. We spent this entire hour talking about the heavy ethical burden placed on doctors. We quoted Virchow saying politics is medicine on a large scale, implying that doctors have a professional duty to prevent the mass casualty event of war.
But what about the rest of us?
That is a fascinating extrapolation of the premise. If a doctor has an ethical sworn obligation not to support systems of death and harm, what if we aggressively applied that exact same logic to other professions?
What if civil and mechanical engineers took a binding Hippocratic oath that explicitly forbade them from designing or manufacturing weapons of mass destruction?
What if supply chain managers, software developers, and logisticians ethically refused, on a professional level, to optimize the movement of artillery shells and drone parts.
You're asking what happens if the prevention of war is viewed not as a niche political choice, but as a mandatory personal professional duty across every sector of the economy.
Right. How quickly would the global war machine grind to a complete screeching halt if the everyday civilians required to build, code, and transport it simply refused, on ethical grounds, to participate? We started this deep dive by talking about how we expect medical diagnoses to be clean and precise, like an X-ray. A bone is broken or it isn't.
We want clear, undeniable lines.
But the truth revealed in this text is that the system itself is what's broken. The X-ray is showing us a society that is meticulously preparing for its own destruction. The question Jona Walk and Wil Verheggen are leaving us with is, now that we can clearly see the fracture on the film, are we actually going to do the hard work to set the bone? Or are we just going to keep ignoring the pain until the system collapses entirely?
It is a terminal diagnosis we simply cannot afford to ignore.
Keep questioning the systems and the information around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.